going to be doing the case Ferry, Follies. I'm Philip Hathorn. I will be the interviewee.
And I'm Bennet Hayes, and I'll be the interviewer.
And this is a relatively short case, and it's mostly interviewee-led.
All right, so your client is a Department of Transportation for a state in the northwestern United States. The Department of Transportation controls 6 modes of transportation: aviation, biking, ferries, rail, public transportation, and walking. With budget cuts and rising energy costs projected for the coming fiscal year, your client evaluated each mode of transportation and determined that it must improve the financial performance of its ferries. The Department of Transportation has employed your firm to assess the current state of its ferry operations and recommend a strategic plan for improving financial performance.
Great. So just to recap, our client is the Department of Transportation for a state in the Northwest United States, and they currently control 6 modes of transportation: aviation, biking, ferries, rails, public transportation, and even walking. And they're experiencing budget cuts, and they want to know how to increase the financial performance specifically for their ferries. And they'd like to understand the current state and then put together a plan to really meet those financial performance goals that they have. Is that correct?
Exactly, yep.
Great. Do they have any specific goals around financial performance? Is this any numbers that they're looking to hit at this point?
Yeah, so our client doesn't have a quantifiable goal. It's really just that improved overall financial performance.
Okay, great. Do you mind if I take a minute to put together my thoughts?
Go for it.
Great. So here I have put together a framework.
Okay.
I'd like to look at the profitability and understand where opportunities are to optimize profitability.
Great.
So first of all, on the revenue side, I've broken it down into our pricing and our volume. On the pricing side, I think we can look at what plans do we currently have. Is it just one-off tickets, or do we have like monthly unlimited ride plans? Maybe optimizing that, we could get more people or be able to charge higher prices. And then second of all here, understanding the pricing. Are we looking to do volume, or are we looking to really be able to charge a higher price for a premium service? So making sure we have the optimal price. On the volume side, just want to make sure we're doing everything we can to drive volume of ferries, really promoting and communicating our service to the people nearby, making sure we have the right locations in the right places, and making sure the customer experience is great, making sure there aren't any problems like parking at the ferry lot is terrible, and that's why we're losing people. So that could be the problem. But then on the other side, we also have costs, and there I'd just like to look at fixed and variable. On the variable side, understanding our labor and our materials that are going into this. So like fuel would probably be a key material, and labor would be the ferry operators and people at the ticket booth, et cetera. Seeing if there are opportunities to decrease those costs. And then on the fixed side, looking at just general overhead, and also looking at our costs of the actual ferries, whether we're leasing those or we own those. Is there any way to decrease that cost? So my first gut feel here is that it's really going to be a more cost opportunity than revenue opportunity, especially if we have a tight deadline to make these cuts.
Okay. Yeah, I think the client would be interested in probing further.
Awesome. So do we know today how much they spend in each of these cost categories?
Yeah, I think the client has relayed a bit of information about the cost structure.
Okay.
And it does account for a lot of the things that you mentioned in terms of both fixed and variable costs. So it turns out there are four main cost buckets for our client.
Okay.
And those are diesel fuel, salaries and wages, overhead costs, and then there's a miscellaneous cost, and that constitutes dock fees and ferry maintenance and other things along those lines.
Okay.
And so I can tell you that diesel fuel accounts for 1/3 of the client's total ferry budget. And that total ferry budget is $270 million.
Okay.
There are also approximately 2,000 employees currently employed by the ferries, excuse me. Their average salaries are $54,000.
Okay, great.
And then finally, overhead constitutes 20% of all costs.
Okay, great. So here I'm just going to do some quick math with 270 being the total. If 1/3 of that is the diesel fuel, then that would be $90 million. If overhead is 20% of the $270 million, that would be $54 million. And then salaries, 2,000 employees at $54,000 per employee, that would be $108 million. If I add these together, that's 198 plus 54 would be 252, which leaves 18 million as a plug for miscellaneous. So here we can see that salaries are the biggest category here, followed closely by diesel fuel. And my first gut reaction to this would be, I know from my experience at the gas station that diesel fuel is very expensive, so maybe there's an opportunity to use a different type of fuel. Salaries being not quite half, but almost half of the budget here seems a little bit high to me. So maybe those two areas, and then overhead along with salaries too, that could be an opportunity for improvement as well. So I'd like to take a look at, I guess, starting with the fuel. Is there any opportunity to maybe change to a different type of fuel, unleaded, or something a little bit cheaper?
Yeah, I think I think that's definitely a consideration our client is open to. And I can tell you too that they've identified through some of your work and some of their internal work that $70 million is kind of the ideal cut for this budget.
Okay.
So you correctly identified that 270. So it does turn out that they have an idea of how they might be able to cut costs. They've done some research, and specifically around the diesel fuel issue that you mentioned, they found out that a switch to alternative fuel sources, and I'm not a fuel expert, I'm not sure if unleaded fits in that category, but that will cut fuel costs by 45% over the next 2 years.
Okay. All right, great. Do we have any similar information for salaries, maybe a number of employees that we'd be able to reduce or cut and still be efficient as a ferry operation?
Yeah, this is always a difficult one to measure, but I think our client has estimated that they could accommodate the following labor reductions over the next 2 years.
Okay.
And those are 10% of ferry captains can be cut, 500 total administrative staff members, and then 100 operational staff members.
Okay, great. And do we have an average salary for each of those categories?
Yeah, so I do have some info on the current breakdown. I can tell you that there are 50 employees that are currently drivers.
Or captains?
Captains,
Okay.
yeah. I think those are synonymous for our client.
Great.
Their average salary is $110,000 per year.
Okay.
It's not a bad living to be a captain. On the admin side, there's 1,300 currently employed.
Okay.
Their average salary is $50,000.
Great.
And then finally, that operational staff member, there's 650 of those,
Okay.
and their average salary is $58,000.
Okay, great. So if I look here at the potential cuts, first of all, we'll go back to the diesel fuel and see how much we could save there.
Okay.
So with a 90 million base starting times that 45%, we'd be looking at, let's see, 50% of 90 million would be 45 million. So 45 would be an additional 1/10 of that. So it'd be 40.5 million in cuts.
Okay.
And so then on the labor side, if we can total up how much we're spending across each of these categories and then figure out how big those cuts would be. So
Sure.
First in captains, we're currently spending $5.5 million. A 10% cut would be 2.55 or 550,000. Then on the admin staff, reducing 500 at a $50,000 salary would be, let's see, 250,000, 2.5 million, 25 million. So, sorry, that needs to go over there. 25 million. And then operational staff, reducing 100 at 58,000, that would give us 5.8 million. Okay. And so if we add all those up, that's 30.8 million plus 550,000, which would be a little over 31 million. And so take that 31 million and add in the 40.5 million. Yeah. We beat the goal, 70 million, but just barely. So I would also want to know what other opportunities we have to make additional cost cuts. Maybe there are some opportunities in overhead. Is there anything in overhead that we could take a look at?
You know, I think that's a consideration that the client looked at, but they haven't found any immediate cuts that could be had there.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what about in miscellaneous? Do we have a breakout, maybe some subcategories within there that we could give us some extra padding to make sure we can hit this 70 million number?
I think another good question, but as of this point, a lot of that miscellaneous is the dock fees, and those are kind of costs set by the city, so there's not much we can do on that front.
Okay. So if there's not much in overhead or miscellaneous, and these are the only cuts for these two categories, the only other thing we could do to again, pad this number and make it a little less risky would be to also look at revenue gains that we might be able to achieve. Do we have any information about the current pricing or plans that are offered or the customer experience?
You know, I think the client relayed to us that they would, once we started doing the cost investigation, that they would like to focus solely on that side of things, and the revenue is somewhat fixed at this point. So again, good thought, but I don't think there's much we can do at this moment.
Okay, great. Do you mind if I take a minute to put together kind of my final thoughts on the case?
That would be great.
Okay. Great. So, in conclusion, we're able to meet that $70 million with these estimates on the fuel cuts, transferring from diesel fuel to an alternative fuel source will give us about 40 million in cuts, and then the other 31 million would come from a labor reduction. So we can meet that goal, but just barely. So there's some risks there. Also risks around the fuel costs. We haven't discussed whether there are any upfront fixed costs. Say we're installing solar panels on the boats, what would that look like? And then also risks around just making cuts to employees. If these are government employees, there could be some extra payouts we have to do. It could affect morale, which obviously is very important. And we also haven't discussed just general trends in the industry. If ferries are becoming less and less popular, we may want to look at getting out of the ferry business completely, or if they're getting more popular, maybe we want to invest even more. Sure. So understanding those trends. But as next steps, I would just shore up some of that research and make sure we feel good about these cuts, maybe look for some extra revenue opportunities if they're out there, and then go ahead with these cost reduction initiatives.
Awesome. Thank you so much for putting this together.
Thank you. So at the beginning of the case, what I was trying to do was take notes as Bennet was giving me the prompt. I tried to use abbreviations because it was a pretty big prompt, make sure I could capture everything, especially what the key ask was. And the key ask was, how can we improve the financial performance of our ferries? I made sure I wrote that down and I circled it or put a rectangle around it, something, so I remembered that's ultimately what the goal is that he has in mind.
Philip also did a good job of asking a clarifying question on the end, just in terms of was there a quantifiable goal that our client was looking to reach, and that's a really good tactic if you want additional information. It's also worth noting Philip did a great job here of getting all the information down. If that doesn't happen and Philip feels like he misheard a piece of the prompt or missed a number, it's always good and almost imperative to ask the interviewer, hey, what did I miss here? What was this number? Just to make sure you're on the same page moving into the case.
So moving into the framework portion of it, because it was a financial performance problem, generally you can assume that's profitability. I like to ask, is that revenue or costs? There wasn't a clear answer, so I created a profitability framework, the most simple framework that you'll see in a consulting case. So essentially profitability is revenue and costs, and then I broke out revenue and costs into what I felt like might be the potential revenue sources and cost sources or cost base of a ferry operator. And so I was sure I made sure I used terminology that would be specific to ferries. For instance, when I talked or spoke about costs, I mentioned fuel. I didn't just say materials because I knew fuel would be specific to ferries. And that's one of the most important pieces of the framework, is mentioning things that are specific to that industry or that company, both in terms of costs and in terms of revenue sources.
And then to conclude Philip's framework, he did a really good job of driving the case forward. So he laid out a lot of potential costs and revenues, but then at the end he had a hypothesis about where this case might find its solution, and that was on the cost side. And he did a great job of isolating that, telling it to the interviewer, and then we moved forward in analyzing the cost structures and how it might impact the overall profitability.
Yep, and along those same lines, if I had, say, gotten my hypothesis wrong and I tried to go down the revenue path, Bennet, being the great interviewer that he is, would have redirected me gently towards costs. So if you don't know which side of your framework to kind of hypothesize on first, that's not a big deal as long as you have some logic to back up why you want to go down that route first.
And then let's talk a little bit more about what you did maybe in the meat of the case, working through the math and working through some of the brainstorms.
Sure. So on the math, when I first got the different costs for the company, I tried to write everything down in the most structured manner that I could. This is a challenge for myself and everyone doing a case. One of the most challenging things is when you get a lot of data that seems to be random. You know, this is 1/3, this is 20%, there's this many employees with these salaries. Writing it down in a structured way. And so that's just something you need to repeat over and over to hone that skill. But ultimately, once you do that, you're going to want to try to figure out what am I trying to calculate. And in this case, it was the just dollar amount of costs for each category. And once I knew that, I tried to calculate it as quickly as I could using mental math. If you need to jot things down and multiply out, that's fine. But mental math will definitely be kind of bonus points as you go through the case.
Also note the communication that Philip undertook while he went through his math. He verbalized almost every single calculation he was making, even down to the minor calculations. It allowed me as the interviewer to know exactly which step he was on and exactly what he was trying to calculate. If he had made a misstep, which would have been totally fine, if he drops a 0, if he puts a 5 where it should be a 2, I see that because I know exactly what he's doing at every second. And if I do see that, given the kind interviewer I am, I would highlight that and we'd be able to move forward through the case. If Philip hadn't communicated everything, if he made a mistake, we might get way too deep into the case where we realize that, hey, our final number's off, can't figure out why. That's when it becomes problematic to make a math error.
Great. And then moving in after that math, what I really tried to do was immediately jump into a hypothesis. Again, at the end of any math or any framework, anything, you want to throw out a hypothesis or a question. And so here I could see that salaries and diesel were the two big categories. And so for me, hearing the word diesel, I think fuel that's expensive, and so I thought maybe there's an opportunity there. And then with salaries just being the biggest bucket, that's always something you should take a look at. What is the biggest cost there's probably some opportunity there. So those were the two we looked at, and he had some more information about that he passed on to me.
I thought it was great too that Philip used a specific in that case, talking about his experience with diesel. Anytime you can ground a case in real world dynamics, it's really effective, because a lot of this is very hypothetical. To bring it back into reality and your own experiences is something that a lot of case interviewers are looking for.
Yep. And then once I calculated that there could be $71 million of potential savings here, again, trying to do a lot of mental math, I think being conscious of 71 million is barely making that $70 million goal that Bennet let me know about. So that's inherently risky when you're barely meeting a goal and you're not, all these numbers are kind of estimates we're just throwing out. So being able to mention that there's risk there, and again, jumping into even more hypotheses about, well, could we look at more revenue things, or is there some overhead we should cut? Just trying to throw out all of the possible opportunities and making sure, when I look back at my framework, making sure there wasn't anything on there that I missed. Making sure I don't mention pricing at the beginning and then never come back to it. You're going to want to kind of mentally tick off everything on the framework and make sure it was covered at some point in the case.
And even though I didn't have answers for Philip on a lot of his extra costs on the overhead, the miscellaneous, and then the potential revenue sources, that doesn't mean that I wasn't impressed or he didn't benefit from asking those questions. Once you see that a number just barely meets its goal, to go through every possible alternative source of cost cutting, or on the other side, revenue gain, is really effective. So just note that just because I didn't have those answers doesn't mean that absolutely was not the right path to head down.
In this case, worked out nicely just because the numbers were a $70 million goal and a $71 million cost savings opportunity. Sometimes you'll see the numbers are not even close to each other, and that could be a good thing, but it could also mean, going back to math mistakes, it could also mean a zero was missed somewhere. So if you see that you've calculated a number that seems to be way too big or way too small, go back and just spot check yourself and make sure that your math is all solid.
And then you did a great job of moving right into the recommendation from there. What were you thinking on that?
Yeah, on the recommendation, I just realized that I had gone through, again, all the branches of my framework, and there wasn't anything really left for me to bring up. So hopefully, at that point, I'm hoping that my framework is exhaustive and that there wasn't some other thing that I needed to think about. Luckily, it was, and so I felt confident recommending to go ahead with these cuts, and then just the biggest thing that's hard to do on the final conclusion is come up with what are the risks of what you're doing. And so just trying to think of what in the world could go wrong if we do this, because what you don't want as a consultant or as a business person is to make a recommendation and something goes wrong and the person comes back and says, you never said that this could have gone wrong. So you want to kind of cover your bases and say all the things that could possibly go wrong, or at least all of the major things that could possibly go wrong, and then wrap it up with some next steps right at the end.
And note that as complete as that recommendation was, it was also very concise. And I think when you think about the three components of a good recommendation, the actual recommendation and what you found, the risks, and the next steps, you don't want that to total more than about 60 seconds. So if you break that into pieces, maybe 15 seconds for what you actually found, the recommendation, about 20 to 30 seconds for risks, and then leave 15 to 20 seconds for next steps. We hope this was helpful, and I think it's important to note too that Philip just ran a very good case, and that's the result of him doing dozens and dozens of cases. So you don't walk in on day one and run a case like this. This is an example of someone who's done it many times.
Good luck, everyone. Remember to just keep practicing, practicing, practicing.